joined today, obviously, with Brandon as always, but we have a special guest on today, a former WWE employee with WWE Magazine. Ed Helinski is joining us. He's a local Central New Yorker and former WWE employee, as I just mentioned, locally in Central New York, and we're coming off of WrestleMania. And first, I want to talk, what years did you work for the WWE, then WWF?
Well, WWF, I go back old school, 1983 to 1987.
So those are some instrumental years because you came on prior to WrestleMania, and then you were there up until WrestleMania 3 or just a little bit thereafter, which a lot of people think is the birth of WrestleMania. At least I do. So with WWF, you worked for the magazine. That's correct?
I was hired by Vince McMahon to start his national magazine, which originally was called Victory, until they got into a problem with it because the wrestling group, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, they had on their masthead that said Victory Magazine Series. And so when they saw the magazine Victory, the letters already came flying out to Titan Sports over in Greenwich, Connecticut, and that put a kibosh to that really fast. And so we had to change it to the official WWF magazine.
So I wish I actually had it on right now. I don't have I have a lot of WWE and magazines from the 2000s, but from prior to 2000, I really just have one, and that's the first one, the Victory magazine with Jimmy Snuka on the cover. So I know that you were obviously instrumental in that. So you came on prior to the start of the magazine, right?
The Jimmy Snuka version was done by somebody else. I came in. My first magazine was a Sergeant Slaughter on the tank cover for Victory magazine, and that was a one and done for the magazine cover. And then we had to switch out at that point. Meanwhile, we also had a venue program that I think we ran 30,000 copies a month on that as well too, that were sold at the various arenas. And they could be major arenas like Madison Square Garden or Philadelphia or Boston, or you would get mid markets like Syracuse or Rochester, or then we even sold them at the high school gymnasium shows, working with the nonprofits. So it was a tiered system back then with WWF wrestling shows at that point. It was instrumental because the guys could work on different finishes and work different angles. There was no internet at this point. Nothing was instantaneous. People got their WWF fix by watching the syndicated TV programs, and this was even prior to USA Cable Network. So what they saw on TV was gospel. So, at a high school gymnasium, you had, say, Slaughter and the Iron Sheik, they worked on one kind of finish. And then they might go to a different venue and work on a different finish. And by the time they were ready to take it to one of the grade A venues like Madison Square Garden or Philly, they knew exactly what they were going to do and how much heat and how much interest would generate from that.
We talk about this all the time about how house shows should take advantage of the idea that it's not on television, that there's no storylines involved, and that we should have matches and stories and things going on that are completely off of television to essentially attract somebody like myself. I mean, I was just at WrestleMania for 5 straight nights. So why exactly would I want to go to a house show, a week or two earlier, and I think what would attract myself as a fan to a lot of stuff like that would be to see something unique. We did see in Syracuse locally at a house show, a few unique things. I think there was like Omos versus Syracuse University stand-up Odyssey Jones, stuff like that. But for the most part, it's a lot of just retreads in the house shows of the same old, sometimes even the exact same matches over and over again. But also to your other point, I will say WWE for a long time has really been lacking when it comes to like event programs. Now, I get the WrestleMania program every year, but it's just a poster book. And for the most part, all the programs are just poster books. But I know what you're talking about, in the early 90s, late 80s, with the fact that, programs were exactly what you expect them to be. They were information. They were programs, you know what I mean? And I remember going to a Monday Night Raw in the 90s, and they were selling a Monday Night Raw magazine as a program. And if you're stupid, you might go, want a program. But I just knew it was just the newsstand magazine being sold as it was more clever than what they've got doing now. You know what I mean? Because they don't even have the magazine anymore. But at least, then they were selling the Raw magazine as the quote unquote program, had nothing to do with the show itself. But going, to the start of your time with WWE, what brought you into the WWE/WWF in 1983? What was your intrigue? How did you even know? I mean, because Paul Heyman, he just had the huge Hall of Fame speech about how he got into the business, his interest, sneaking into Madison Square Garden. So exactly how did you come into the fold of Titan Sports?
I grew up in Western New York in the Buffalo area. And we were very, very fortunate because we had Friday Night Wrestling on TV. We had the feed from Maple Leaf Gardens with Canadian wrestling. We had another feed from Hamilton, Ontario. So we were always inundated and had access to professional wrestling. And growing up as a kid, I got the interest, I got the bug, it struck my fancy. The beginning of June of 1983, I'm a sports writer working at the Auburn Citizen, and a press release comes in from a group from Geneva who are putting on a wrestling show at Cougar Community College. And I said, whoa, this could be a very interesting thing to do. The show was June 16th. It was a Thursday night. And I said, geez, I should call and see if I could get credentials for this. Not knowing that it was almost impossible to get any mainstream media to get credentials for one of their events. So I was able to track down their number down at Cape Cod and was put through to a guy named Ed Cohen. And Ed Cohen booked a lot of the buildings back then for Titan Sports before we came to Greenwich, Connecticut. And I said, look, Ed, I grew up in Western New York. I understand the wrestling, a little bit about wrestling. What we do will be just it'll be a respectful piece. And he said, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll let you in, but whatever you do, send to me. I said, sure, that would be happy to do that. So the show went off on a Thursday night, and I did like a retrospect piece about professional wrestling. Do you remember Tex McKenzie or Sweet Daddy Siki or Whipper Billy Watson? And now you have Sergeant Slaughter and you have Swede Hansen, and Arnold Skolin. And so I did a piece for the Friday paper, and a photographer, Steve Taylor, back then newspapers had picture pages. So he did a whole picture page on Sunday. So that came out, was fabulous. So I kept my word. I collected everything, put it in an envelope, mailed it off to the Cape. And about 3 days later, Ed Cohen calls me up and says, hey, we love what you guys are doing. Would you guys be interested in interviewing for magazine positions? We're starting this national magazine, and we're looking for an editor, and we're looking for a photographer. So I said, sure, I'm 25 years old. I'm footloose, fancy free. Why not? Steve, on the other hand, was married, no children yet, but he took the chance as well, too. It was about 2 weeks later, we were flown into the Cape. We interviewed with several people, Linda McMahon being one of them, Vince McMahon being one of them. We were hired on the spot, and we negotiated our deals at that point. So, we were in the fold, and then we looked at each other and said, what did we actually do? We put in our notice. People thought we were crazy up here to join the circus. And that's okay, you look at that as only one kind of opportunity. Vince explained that, he wanted to go national at that point, but we didn't really know what that meant. We didn't actually know the scope of his operations at that point. We had some sort of an idea, but it was rather intricate even back then. And so our first gig was July 31st, 1983, Madison Square Garden, a packed house, and we walked into the place, and we were starstruck. We were looking up. We had the deer in the headlight look right away. It was crazy. And I was very fortunate. A guy named Fred Blassie took me under his wing immediately. And Fred, you come here, kid. I'm going to teach you some things. And he did. One of the things he taught me right away is watch between matches the amount of money that changes hands, because people in the stands used to gamble on what the finishes were. And you would see money changes hands. And it was the craziest, nuttiest thing you ever saw. The other thing we learned and were taught was how to watch for when blood was going to happen. And, if you're not used to it, you'll never see it. But if you look at the subtle things and don't look at the main action, you'll see it happen each and every time. Plain as day, believe it or not.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you can, you don't necessarily, the idea is they're trying to hide it a little bit. Did you run into Paul Heyman at all in the back there?
I might have back then, but Paul was probably 16 years old at the point. But the thing was, back then, Vince didn't allow any outside media. So the answer is no. When Vince took over, all bets were off with Vince Senior's deals, and Vince didn't want anybody. He didn't want Bill Apter. Certainly didn't want Paul Heyman. There's another photographer from that era, and his name escapes me at this point, but none of them were allowed in. Because Vince was doing the magazine, and he was going to do it his way, and he didn't want them competing.
And I got to ask you, so your negotiations with Vince and Linda, you got to tell us, how did that go down? That had to be quite an interesting negotiation.
Vince didn't have anything to do with it. They had a guy named Todd Dietrich who was a vice president with them, and he's the one who did the deal with us. And Todd was a very successful businessman from the Albany area. How he hooked up with the McMahons is beyond me. Todd never came with us to Connecticut. He finished up with at the Cape, and he took care of the business of the Cape when they eventually sold that building. So Todd was the one who negotiated the pay for us. Actually, it wasn't painful whatsoever.
Was the photographer you're thinking of George Napolitano?
Correct, George Napolitano.
Okay. Gotcha.
George was locked out too. They all were locked out.
I just met him. I'm not too familiar on all the obviously I know Bill Apter and stuff like that. But I just met him just this past weekend and kind of learned. I went back in time, meeting him for the first time this past weekend in Philadelphia at a SiriusXM Busted Open gathering, and then obviously learning about the history. And to be fair, I don't mean to age anybody out, but when you can see some people, you can kind of guess how long they've been in the business, because you don't see a lot of people that look like Tom Brokaw, still around. If you see them around today taking photos, then they've probably been around for quite a period of time in the wrestling business. I don't think you see a lot of people, in the older ages just start to become wrestling photographers. But the best part about this is you were around, like I said, from 83 to 87, and so much changes in that time. You go from prior to anything really on closed circuit, prior to WrestleMania, up until around WrestleMania 3. What did WrestleMania mean for you at the magazine? What did it mean for sales of the magazine, for the job yourself? Did it change anything you guys were doing at all?
Well, to give you how things ran at this point, the magazine was an easy sell when we started it because we had television. So you would see in everything was staged on purpose. The kids that you saw with the foam fingers and the T-shirts and the headbands and the magazine, all that stuff was staged. And were we pandering to the youth? Yep, and their parents too. Absolutely. I mean, that's the way it was done. So when we talked about the magazine at that point, the WWF magazine, on stands now, it sold itself rather easily. Now, I was replaced in 1984, working for the McMahon family. It's a funny thing. You have a shelf life, just like a wrestler. You don't know how long your shelf life is. You're the last one to know. So they wanted to go in a different direction with that, and of course that was their prerogative. So they moved me over into marketing and merchandising. So we had, the LJN toys were coming out at that point, and the rings, and all the T-shirts and posters and that. And of course, we marketed it on TV, so that was an easy sell on that stuff. So when it came to WrestleMania 1 and the hype, wasn't bad whatsoever because everything was being put in place. The biggest challenge was getting merchandise to these closed circuit arenas because you wanted to take advantage of that captive crowd. Madison Square Garden, we emptied a warehouse and sent a lot of it over to Madison Square Garden, let the chips fall where they may. Same thing held true for the WrestleMania 2, the only Monday WrestleMania, by the way, that was done on at Nassau Coliseum, the Rosemont Horizon, and the LA Sports Coliseum. And of course, there was closed circuit venues with that as well, too. WrestleMania 3, unbelievable with that crowd that was there. We did back then $550,000 worth of merchandise and program sales that day. Equate that to today's dollars is $1.5 million that we did that day.
Wow.
Now we're only talking about $8 T-shirts and $10 items here. Foam fingers for $5 or $6. So it's not today's prices, and back then it was huge at that point. I also had to have bootleggers outside, the stadium in Detroit arrested for bootlegging, selling merchandise out in the parking lot. I mean, there was a lot of that went on, and a lot of the
still exists today.
Business took off. So what?
That still exists today. I mean, I was outside of Lincoln Financial Field last week, and there was people coming up to our tailgate trying to sell us, non-licensed WrestleMania shirts and Royal Rumble. There was non-licensed shirts outside of there, so it still is alive. In fact, I want to tell you, probably the place it's the most alive is in Buffalo. I mean, I go to lots of different venues all over, but it's always in Buffalo outside of their arena more than a lot of others. I mean, like from Armageddon to Battleground to Night of Champions to Great American any of the pay-per-views I've ever attended from the WWE there, always with a counterfeit shirt, which shows you it's in Buffalo because I go to these smaller, in your house style pay-per-views, and the fact that, they've always got shirts for them, not just, like the big ones like WrestleMania and such. Moving over though.
You have to understand something. Let me just before keep my train of thought real quick. This was the time period where Vince went and started taking over territories, rating talent, getting on TV, Battleground for TV in St. Louis, Cincinnati, Minneapolis. My job with the magazine was to call these different territories and say, hey, we got this new magazine that we're doing. Would you like us to come in and we'd like to do a photo spread of your talent. Would you like us to come in, and can we come in and take pictures of some of the boys? And of course, they unknowingly said yes. And Steve Taylor would go in there, and he would palm off business cards to a certain talent who he was instructed to go see. And Steve's message was, nice to meet you, please call Vince. So we went in and rated talent that way.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and at TV back then, TV was at Allentown and Hamburg, Pennsylvania every 3 weeks. You would see new people, 5 or 6 new different talents every week coming in. And between Steve Taylor and Howard Finkel, Howard was a wonderful man and a terrific mole. He knew how to he doesn't get enough credit. I mean, for the work behind the scenes work that he did for the McMahon family in the World Wrestling Federation. Howard would get all these different TV tapes from the different territories. He would work his magic with the TV stations and get copies of them. So then they knew what was happening with these talents and who they could observe and think that they could do something with them. So it was quite integrated at that point. And also at that point, we went from the USA Cable Network came into play, rock and wrestling with MTV. I mean, that was just prior to WrestleMania 1. And then you had NBC, with Hulk and NXT going on Saturday Night Live the night before WrestleMania 1 on March 31st. And so everything, we went mainstream, and mainstream gravitated to professional wrestling. It was the craziest thing and a lot of fun at that point. And we just shook our heads and stayed within the kayfabe mantra, and life was good at that point.
When you were working with the merchandise, did you work ever? I know he worked obviously as a child, but did you work a lot with Shane McMahon, moving around merchandise, and or Stephanie McMahon, who was a model for some of that merchandise way back in the day?
Shane worked for me, as a matter of fact. He was a 15-year-old snot-nosed kid, high-strung, hard-working kid. His father let me have the opportunity to beat the hell out of him, and Vince had no problems with it. Now, Stephanie was probably, at that point, when I first met Stephanie, her first WrestleMania, I think she was 8 years old. So I would have known her to back until maybe she was 10, maybe 11 years old. So was she modeling at that point? No. Shane had did some modeling work for some of the Blaze T-shirts and whatnot. So in the earlier WWF magazines, you'll see Shane in there, or a cock to the side where you can't actually see his face, but it's him in there.
Gotcha. So in 1987, when abouts after or before WrestleMania 3, you said you were obviously part of WrestleMania 3. So when abouts in 1987 did you then part from the WWF, and for what reason?
It was August of 1987. I was in the process of getting married, and I'm marrying a girl from Auburn, New York. And it comes a time you've got to make a decision on whether you want to move her down there, and I might not be around much because you would be on the road or gone on trips, and risk ruining your marriage right off the bat, or would we would move to a different place, or I would come back to Auburn. So it was pointing more and more that I was coming back to Auburn. And I probably was a little bit too loud and boisterous about it. So when I was due for a review for a pay raise, I was brought in and congratulated for a job well done, and your services are no longer needed. And that wasn't Vince. It wasn't Vince. It wasn't Linda. It was a guy named Lou Dundell, who was a significant other of Pat Patterson.
Gotcha.
And I gotta ask you real quick. So I can relate to that very much, not the moving part of it, but as somebody who currently has a wife and 2 kids, I can relate to that. So I've done some of that stuff myself in the media business. So it's, hearing that from somebody like yourself, it hits home for me because I've had to make some changes myself. I do have to ask you though, during your time in WWE, like I've seen the pictures online. I know you were at a local restaurant, Eva's, with Sergeant Slaughter. I've seen a few pictures. I have to ask you. I know I've heard the great stories about Sergeant Slaughter. Who are some other guys that you've stayed in touch with after all these years? I got to hear this.
I was very good friends with Andre the Giant.
Andre.
And I'll tell you a story about Andre. Is that after I left, Tim White, the great Tim White, was in my wedding. He was my usher. And Tim and I are lifelong friends. And of course, Tim White was the traveling companion bodyguard for Andre the Giant. And Tim White could handle himself. He was a sparring partner. He was an amateur boxer, but he also sparred with marvelous Marvin Hagler. He could handle himself. So there was a show in Buffalo at the old Memorial Auditorium, and Andre was on the card. And Tim says, "Come on to the show." And I said, "Nah, we'll catch up with you afterwards. Where you guys staying?" And there was a hotel near the arena. So we caught up with him in the bar and whatnot. And I got to see firsthand how Tim White handled things, because he could just sense when trouble was brewing. And there were about 3 guys coming towards Andre. And Tim just jumped right in front and put his hands up and said, "Not tonight, fellas. Not tonight. Take it elsewhere." And these guys backed down. And I remember asking Tim, and I said, "How did you know that?" He goes, You can hear it in the floor. You can sense it in the air. You can smell it. And he goes, this happens all the time, everywhere we go. It's just, and it was really tough. Now, with Andre, the story was he's having drinks with us, and we got talking about getting married in May of 1988. And Andre just, quite frankly, goes, can I come to your wedding? Sure, boss, if you want to come. But when is the date? It's May 14th. And he knew 5 months in advance. He goes, I cannot make it. I'll be in Hartford that night. So he knew he was booked. The thing is that he couldn't go. He wanted to be a normal person, but he couldn't live a normal life. He couldn't sleep in a normal bed. He couldn't travel in a normal vehicle. He couldn't fly. You know, took up 2 seats in an airplane. People gawked and pointed their fingers at him. You felt bad for the guy in that. But during the conversation, he looks at my wife and says, well, tell me, what color are the bridesmaid gowns going to be? So it was just as goofy as it was, you know, he took those things. Now, Andre, you know, it took me about 2 years to befriend Andre. Andre determines when if he's going to be friends with you.
Yeah.
And I knew Andre had a little girl. And I would have a conversation. You get to see your daughter very much. And he would talk about it as much as he wanted to. But, you know, at that point, he felt he could trust me at that point. So the day that Andre passed away, I couldn't sleep that night. And I turned on the radio, and for some reason, I tuned into WFAN out of New York. And then they announced that Andre the Giant died, and I cried my eyes out at that point. I mean, it was a tough call. Slaughter, we've been friends for 40 years. I was very close with the Iron Sheik, Tony Atlas, but Tony went off the rails a few times. Slaughter and I saw him I caught up with him about 20 years ago, and he acted like we hadn't seen each other in a week. And then when I saw him about 5 years ago over at the baseball stadium in Syracuse, he stopped what he was doing at probably a couple hundred people in line waiting for his autograph. And he said, excuse me, folks, I have an old friend here that I need to say hello to. And he came up to me and gave me a big hug, and he started talking like things from 1984. And I said, Bob, stop it. You're going to make me cry. And we've stayed in touch. You know, he came to WrestleCuse. He was here last year as well too for the toy show as well too. And when we get together, we have a lot of fun. We really do. And he's one of the boys who trust me. We're old school. He's a kayfabe guy just like I am. You know, don't talk too much. You know, and try to stay within character. Now, those lines are blurred, but we still respect the business for that point. You know, I mean, I'm really fortunate.
I've got a framed poster from an Onondaga County War Memorial Show in 1984 in my living room, and it's got Tony Atlas on it. And I think it was like 2008. I saw him in the origin days, or so 2006 actually, the origin days of 2CW here in Central New York, and he was on a show, and I tried to get him to sign it, and he told me he didn't necessarily want to sign it because he doesn't believe that he was at that show, because he stated that he was advertised for a lot of shows that he never actually made. Do you know any validity to that?
As I said, he went off the rails. And sometimes when they put these things, you know, a lot of guys, when they're having problems, wouldn't make the shots. Snuka was notorious for that. That's why they put Buddy Rogers with him as his manager. Buddy was towards the end of his career, and Buddy despised having to be a glorified babysitter for Snuka. You know, Snuka would get into town, and then he would get into involved in some of the bad habits that he had, and would then mix it with a little praising Jesus and be getting religious, and he was really off the rails, and he wasn't making the buildings. The thing with these guys that they were on pretty much 21 days straight. then they would get a 7-day break. I mean, it's a toll on you mentally, it's a toll on you physically, and there are way too many distractions when you're out on the road. Everybody's your friend. Everybody wants to give you something. Not always a piece of advice that they want to give you either. So I mean, there were a lot of things that were given the guys, and the guys liked it, and they started purchasing it.
So the final thing we'll talk with you about is simply, obviously, 1987, you wrapped your time up with the WWF. But since then, I mean, it's been about 30 plus years. What has been some memorable things that have brought you back into wrestling that you've been a part of? I know you just mentioned WrestleCuse, which took place in Central New York here. But what's some other wrestling events that you've had the privilege of being a part of or attending, and getting to reconnect with some stars and wrestlers of the past?
You know, quite frankly, we started a family, and wrestling was the furthest thing from my mind. It wasn't up until maybe 20 years ago when I heard Sergeant Slaughter on the radio on one of the Syracuse radio stations, and I called in, and they let me through to him, and we talked on the air, and we talked in kayfabe, and he knew exactly who I was. That was a big moment, but probably 5 years ago. I mean, it's funny how it's the circle of life. Things come around in full circle, and I'm enjoying the ride for it right now. I'm appearing in a book, Brad Belugin's book, The Six Pack, pages 118 to 122 and page 124. So he'll be coming to Syracuse April 26th and 27th. He'll be here. We're doing a book signing at Parthenon in downtown Syracuse. So that's a fabulous book. I read it, 304 pages of it. You know, if I'm in it for 4 or 5 pages, that's 1.5%. I'm good with it. I'm a fan in wrestling history.
Really quick, I do have to ask you about the current product, because I do see you're on social media. I saw you. I think there was some the Bloodline content. I think I saw a solo with the finger up or something on. I think it was recently on your Twitter account. So what are your thoughts on the general product of WWE these days? I have to hear you on that.
The storylines aren't that defined. They're not that strong. Back, and maybe I'm an old codger now, but back then when we had the house shows and whatnot, we didn't have writers. They're writing storylines. The wrestlers and the road agents determine the storylines, and that's what they got to work on and practice on. I don't think that's enough going on of that today. Yeah, you're leaving at the guys who may be good writers, but do they know wrestling? So I don't think the storylines are that well defined. The wrestlers seem to be a lot lighter. When we had back then Andre, Big John, Stud, Bam Bam Bigelow. We had some big men, and they were brutes. And I'm not taking anything away from CM Punk or Drew McIntyre or not, but I think that in today's wrestling, maybe Randy Orton could compete with the guys back in the 80s because of his size and stature. A lot of these guys are a lot smaller. They're terrific at what they do, but the storylines are not that deep.
Yeah, I got to agree with you there a little bit in the sense of what you're talking about. There's a lot of interesting stories that I think a lot of fans turn into things. There's lots of great segments, but the stories aren't necessarily there. We got with The Rock and Cody Rhodes, we had a lot of great segments, and I feel like the fans are filling in the stories a little bit with the segments, very obviously similar to what we just saw recently last night with AEW here that everybody's been talking about all week regarding that footage. I think they present something and then the fans talk about it. I think that's what I've noticed a lot lately, and I can understand what you're saying with the storylines being a little deeper. The Macho Man Hulk Hogan story being very well defined in the 80s. There was no social media. There was no fans kind of wondering what that meant. Yeah, Bray Wyatt, I think he went solely on on social media. I mean, what he did was a lot of just random things, and fans filled in the blanks of what this means and what that's supposed to mean. Back in the day, you would have to have it defined what that means.
You have to understand AEW, what they did was a publicity stunt solely, because now they're behind the eight ball after this WrestleMania. I mean, in Philadelphia, and from what I've seen, and I saw part of the show as well too, it was well done. It was very, very successful. So AEW has no choice but to do that type of stunt. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, and if it was up to Vince and he was behind the eight ball, he would have done the same thing. Um, think about the old wrestling, the Monday Night Wars. They were always topping each other because they wanted that. They needed that Monday Night title, so to speak. And the WWF, WWE, they outlasted them because they were stronger at that point. Were there a lot of things that Vince did good? Oh, absolutely. But a lot of meddling and the things that he would change, even with me back then, and I'm sure that continued for all these years. He a pain in the ass when it comes to stuff like that. Whereas I think with Triple H, he let things evolve. Was the storyline not as deep? Probably, yeah, definitely. But the show was terrific and a lot of excitement. I mean, it's how Drew McIntyre lost that match, and that was kind of, the Money in the Bank angle. That was kind of a stretch. The 6-man Philadelphia Brawl, you could have put that before Drew McIntyre in the show. They could have led that off.
Well, I think with WrestleMania, you got to lead off strong, right? I mean, I can see why that 6-man tag was in the spot, because you got to have these lulls in action, right? Back in the day when you were doing shows, I mean, I don't know how they were in the 80s. I know a lot what the cards are, but was the idea to start the card off with something big and then kind of have nothing in the middle, or was it just like you could get to the building late and you didnn't miss anything kind of thing?
No, you always started with the undercard. You had the Sweet Hansons, you had the Butcher Vachons, and they built up with momentum. You didn't put your main event until basically the end, because you wanted people to be there. You wanted something right before intermission, and a big splash, and then it would some sort of fuse, some sort of angle, and then they would announce next month's card at the Garden. And that intermission period was for people to rush down to the box office and buy tickets for the next month. So everything was done that way. They inserted one in the middle and then one at the end. But everything else was prelim guys, And they wanted to try some different things to see if they could market these guys and see if they could draw some money.
Yeah, I mean, well, like you say, obviously starting off slow, I mean, it would take something it's easier, I guess, for the 6-man tag to draw some money in that spot because you've already got the people in the building for one of the co-main events. But if you're trying to get people in the building early, like a leadoff band or like a warm-up band, you can tell if they're drawing money if they get people in the building early or if people are showing up late and obviously missing out on that. So I think they got to show that, word gets out that these undercard guys can get people actually at 7:00 into the building at the start of the show instead of trickling in, minutes later, knowing they're not missing the main event or not missing like what's close to intermission, one of the big matches there for sure.
I think that the 6-man was put in that place because they had to introduce Snoop. And when they brought Snoop in, who was the sponsor at that point? It was the alcoholic beverage of Snoop Dogg and the other artists. So I think it was a promised spot that you're not going to lead off. We're going to put you in the second spot. We'll put you over. You're wearing the T-shirt about the drink, the beverage, and we're going to sell bottles of that for you.
Well, and there's the other thing. They did the same thing with the Rey Mysterio match as well, where they brought the Philadelphia Eagles guys in as luchador masks. So it's almost like the same kind of match build-up and match placement, I guess.
Yeah, there's a reason why they do some of these things. I would disagree with where they put it. I still would have led off with Snoop. I think Snoop is a very strong person to lead off a show with. So, but that's why I don't make the big bucks, and I live in Central New York, and these guys are elsewhere.
All right. Well, I'll make sure on this video on YouTube, you'll see Twitter that you can follow, Ed Helinski at Mr. Ed 315. Final thoughts I will ask you about Mike Rotunda being another local guy from Owego, New York, but went to Syracuse University and always built as being from Syracuse, New York during his early days. You probably had some run-ins with Mike Rotunda back in the day.
Right.
Was that kind of special seeing him when you were working there with a Syracuse Letterman jacket, in the 84, 85 time?
Of course it was. Yeah, the Syracuse guy. The other one that was like that was Adrian Adonis, Keith Frankie, and he was from the Buffalo area where I grew up. He grew up in Kenmore, and I grew up in Buffalo. And guys like Rotundo and Frankie, Adrian Adonis, we talked a lot, about, because we're upstate New York guys. It's just like, there weren't many of us. I mean, you had people from all over the country, all over the world that were coming on board, and you never know who was coming and who was going sometimes. And you'd walk backstage, and there would be Bobo Brazil, or there would be Dusty Rhodes, or Big Ernie Ladd. Like, whoa. Or you see John Stossel's backstage, and next thing you know, you hear Dave Schultz knocking the hell out of him,
Were you near that when that happened?
I was about 15 feet away from that. I was out of camera, but I saw it. I heard it. And to this day, there's no doubt in my mind that Vince told Schultz to go after him.
Yeah, I have to think, Mike Rotunda with the whole, I remember coming back out in the Letterman jacket and being a former football player with Syracuse University. It's kind of a model of what they're doing today. And I know, there was a big long gap where wrestlers were former professional wrestlers or maybe bodybuilders. You found them at the gyms. But Mike Rotunda was kind of what we're seeing today, where they went after somebody who was a football player. Now, I know it wasn't Vince directly, but it was, somebody who went up to him, as he said in his speech at the Hall of Fame, that said, hey, have you ever thought about professional wrestling? In which he didn't, right, as an amateur wrestler and a football player, and kind of did what they're doing with the Gabe Stevensons and, some of the other talent, like the Tiffany Stratton, who come from this collegiate world, who maybe never thought about professional wrestling. And because they're just overall athletes, are being drawn in. And Mike Rotunda's, I don't want to say he's one of the first, because there might have been people before him, but he's one of the first that I can remember where, yeah, he was a football player, probably wanted to go to the NFL, and somebody presented to him this avenue that he was unfamiliar with, and it turned out to be a pretty decent career.
I can tell you who it was. It was the late, great Dick Fire, the Destroyer. Dick was a Syracuse guy. He played football at Syracuse University. He coached on the 1959 National Championship team at Syracuse. He was an assistant coach. He's the one that went to Rotundo and said, hey, why don't you try professional wrestling? And Dick trained Mike in a lot of ways as well, too. Dick lived over in Akron, New York, not too far. And Dick and I became very good friends the last 15 years of his life. And Dick would always come back to the Syracuse University football alumni events, the golf outings in the summer. Dick was a terrific guy and an icon in Japan. Oh, my God. On the West Coast in Japan, he was, especially Japan, he was huge. Huge. So his with the Ricky Dozon and Dick Fire in the 60s. Look it up. It was huge. And Dick received one of the highest awards ever given to a civilian in Japan history. The award, I think, of the Rising Sun. I mean, Dick was not a big man, but he was a lot of fun. I miss Dick.
All right. Well, I appreciate all these great stories, talking about the time you not just worked for the WWE, then WWF, when you worked with them from 1983 to 1987, but such a integral part of the company. Then I can't really think of a 4-year span that is more integral in this company. Maybe, I guess you could say 95 to 99 were that was a very important 4-year span, going from the cartoon era to the attitude era in that time. But you went from 2 years before WrestleMania to WrestleMania being an established thing and WWF taking off. So there really wasn't a more integral. You were there at the ground level. I know the WWF and stuff existed before, but really being there at the ground level of seeing Vince McMahon's, original days of taking over and seeing it firsthand, probably, 4 years that I can imagine that are probably some of the most integral and most important in professional wrestling history. And you had a front seat to it.
Next time I'll tell you guys about the Iron Sheik doing a photo shoot in front of the United Nations with the Khomeini flag. And then Sergeant Slaughter, we did a photo shoot one Sunday morning in Washington, D.C. and in front of the White House. Those are two interesting stories. But we'll do it as a TV teaser. Until next time.
All right. Again, on Twitter, Mr. Ed315. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to talk to you again.
Thanks, Charlie.